I'm going to try to provide some background for Andrea Levy's Small Island. There's a few things I want to talk about. The first is the genre that I see this novel fitting into, and that's what Linda Hutcheon, who's a Canadian literary theorist, calls historiographic metafiction. For Hutcheon, historiographic metafiction is the dominant genre of postmodernism. Postmodernism, just as an aside, is a word that actually in literary studies we're getting further and further away from, but I find a lot of students like to use it. Part of the reasons we're getting away from it is because there's no common accepted definition of what it is, and there's several different competing definitions, and so whenever you want to use the word, you end up having to spend 15 minutes trying to clarify what you actually mean by it, and people are still going to disagree with it. So I'm going to just use the term historiographic metafiction here in preference to postmodernism, just acknowledging that for some people, they're basically one and the same. Historiographic metafiction for Hutcheon is a novel or a fiction that is historiographic, meaning it's not just historical. Historical fiction generally has been realist fiction that is set in the past. And it's been a genre since the early 19th century with the novels of Sir Walter Scott. The difference between history and historiography is the study of how we write history. How do we know what happened in the past? So rather than simplifying questions such as how do we know, what happened in the Middle Ages, historiography actually foregrounds that. It thus makes difficult and makes problematic assumptions about how history is made. Literally, if you go to the Greek roots of the word, graphic, of course, means written. So it's about the writing of history, the construction of history, and not taking history itself as a given to which we have automatic and easy access. Metafiction is fiction that is aware that it is fiction, and plays with the genres, and self-consciously it occasionally acknowledges that it is fiction. In this context, what we're talking about is it's metafiction that it is aware that it is constructing history. So it's very self-conscious about the idea that it's not taking history as a given, something that we always already know what happened because we read it about in 12th grade or something like that, but instead is investigating how history is constructed and acknowledging at some level that history is actually constructed, much like fiction is. And from that, you get, it's a small step to history is fiction, which is, I think, not a purely relativistic idea that, everybody has their own story and there's no point in trying to reconcile them. So much it is an acknowledgement that history is incredibly complex, and whatever version of events we eventually come down to sharing as a culture is inevitably simplified, and inevitably something has been repressed in it. In the case of Levy, I think what she's, most obviously what she's talking about is in the history of World War II in Britain, which is, of course, a huge history and very important to British identity in the late 20th century. People tend not to think about the inclusion of colonial people into that history. And specifically in this situation, they don't think about Caribbean and even more specifically Jamaican people being part of that history of resistance to Nazi Europe. So in some ways, what Levy's doing is going back into history as a text and intervening into it and calling attention to the construction of history and asking us to re-see it and reconstruct it. Not to give up on it and say it's all relative, but to rewrite our history of World War II in light of knowledge that we have managed to forget in intervening decades. Now, it helps to keep in mind that Levy herself is writing the history not of her own generation. She did that in her first couple of novels, but the history of her parents' generation. Levy herself is a native Londoner born in 1956, whose parents immigrated to Britain from Jamaica. So, and this is not simply a fictionalized version of her parents' story, but it is generationally a story from which she is one generation removed. In other words, she's reconstructing all of this. This is not her personal experience. Levy herself also, if you're an aspiring novelist, it might be useful to you to know, really only began writing fiction in her mid-30s as part of a relatively late awakening. Small Island is her fourth novel, and it's probably the one that's gotten the most attention. Okay, some background for this novel. The Windrush, the ship, sailed from Jamaica to England in 1948, and symbolically it's become a very important symbol. Sorry, that was an awful sentence. It's become an important symbol in British culture as sort of the start of a multicultural Britain. The story of the Windrush is actually interesting in that it had just come from Britain to Jamaica and dropped a lot of goods and people off. And basically what they decided to do was sell a lot of really cheap tickets so that they weren't carrying a mostly empty ship back to Britain. So a relatively large number of people decided, more or less spur of the moment, to immigrate from Jamaica to Britain. Now, because of changes in the law and the formation of what after World War II began to be known as the Commonwealth, basically Britain decided to reform the empire as the Commonwealth, with much less direct British control. In many cases, beginning in India in 1947, nations that had been colonies became independent and maintained a semi-formal relationship called the Commonwealth with Britain. That didn't happen in Jamaica until much later, the formal independence. So for quite a number of years, anyone in a Commonwealth country could legally immigrate to Britain. And so what you get after World War II, interestingly enough, is a kind of colonization in reverse. For centuries, people have been leaving Britain to go colonize other places. Now, post-World War II, people from those colonies are coming to the home country. And as Levy points out, especially in Jamaica, it's thought of as the home country by people who've never been there, and even whose ancestors did not come from there. And yet, for generations before their birth, it has been their administrative center. Now, one of the ways I think Levy, well, a couple ways in which Levy is historiographically metafictive about this. One of them is, if you recognize with the novel very quickly, it consists of a series of first-person narrations. In other words, there is no objective voice. There is no narrator telling you what the truth actually is and letting you know that somebody is right or somebody is wrong. Your job as a reader is basically to figure it out for yourself, to try to put these different narratives together and come up with something like an overall story, which may or may not be synonymous with anything like objective truth. Another way in which I think she functions is to question how history is constructed by calling attention to events that have been forgotten or nearly forgotten. One of these, of course, as already mentioned, is Caribbean participation in World War II. This had already happened in the First World War, that Britain called upon its colonies for troops. It happened again in the Second World War. And this is something that only within the last 10 years or so, Britain has really been reconfronting the presence of colonial troops in all areas of World War II on the British side, both in Britain itself and also in the various places in which the war was fought, which is practically the entire globe. So specifically with Levy, she's calling attention to Caribbean participation in World War II. The idea especially that World War II was not fought exclusively by native Britons. Secondly, I think she wants to kind of resurrect a history of racial tension and unrest in wartime Britain. Part of this is brought about, of course, by there being large numbers of American troops that are stationed in Britain after the U.S. entry into the war in 1941. And I think it helps to remember, because it is not explicitly pointed out in the novel, it's pretty much just assumed, that we need to remember that the U.S. armed forces in World War II were strictly racially segregated. There were separate units for white soldiers and black soldiers, and there was no such thing, for instance, as a black U.S. officer. Black units were commanded by white officers. And the riot, for instance, that takes place in the book, in the movie house, I don't know whether that's a specific historical event, but there were several incidents like that. Several incidents in which racial unrest within different races in the U.S. Army and tension between British natives and American soldiers boiled over into violence. This is, of course, not part of most people's understanding of World War II. World War II is all the Allies getting together to nobly resist fascism. And Levy, I think, is in many ways trying to unrepress some of these memories, make us again go back into the text of World War II and rewrite it in light of these events that did take place, and there is historical record of, but don't fit so well with sort of mainstream constructions, which is to say interpretations of the war and wartime culture. Also, Bernard, which is the British pronunciation of his name, is stationed in Burma and then ends up in India. And just some historical background for what he goes through there. Burma, of course, is the same place that pre-war Orwell had been stationed and wrote about in Killing an Elephant. Bernard is involved in what came to be known later as Direct Action Day, which is August 16th of 1946, which were large-scale riots between Hindus and Muslims in Bengal, which is to say East India. And it's a part of the partition of India, that those riots were a part of partition of India between what became ultimately the nation-state of India and the eastern part of the nation-state of Pakistan. So it's pointing out that the decolonization of British India is violent. There also may be some implied critique in that the British were notoriously late in calling out the armed forces to try to put a stop to the slaughter. Basically, Burnett and the other troops only show up when most of the damage has already been done. Another part of this is the post-war British demobilization strikes, another part of World War II that we tend not to think of. We think, there was VE Day, there was VJ Day, and then, peace reigned and everybody went home. And in many cases, it took a long time to get the troops home, especially some of the British troops who were still where they had been stationed during the war for up to a year after the end of the war. And this didn't sit well with the soldiers. Many of them went on strike, organized strikes, and sometimes had socialist or communist leadership, and Bernard is sort of on the edges of that. Again, not something that we tend to think of as part of the mainstream history of World War II. Finally, I think culturally what the book is about, and overall thematically, of course, is British multiculturalism. That since World War II, Britain has increasingly become a multicultural and multiracial society with citizens of African, Caribbean, Indian, and other nationalities. This is, of course, a huge development, especially in the last 20 or 30 years of British literature. There is the literature from the mid-century by Caribbean English writers, Caribbean British writers. But especially since the 80s, this is really a lot more writers of non-native British racial backgrounds have become writers and gained a lot of attention for themselves. Levy, of course, is one of them. Other famous ones include Monica Ali, Salman Rushdie, and Zadie Smith. So if you're interested in this, books by those writers would be a good place to start experiencing Britain as a multicultural nation.